Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Dixon, and today we've got Greg Povenski on. He is currently getting his PhD at Oklahoma State University. But he spent 23 years of his life in the U.S. Army before getting out and getting an executive MBA at Kellogg before shifting into private equity via being a operating partner at Cold Bore Capital, and then actually transitioned into a venture capital firm that is focused on space ventures. So very, very fascinating. But we dig in deep on this one because his PhD dissertation is around operational efficiency within private equity and also how we can create value better within a private equity firm. And we dig into a lot around talent. We talk about kind of how do we assess talent and even how some hiring processes maybe could be improved with the use of some assessments and some tools. So super fascinating as we dig in deep about kind of operational efficiency within the private equity world. So let's get Greg on the pod. Interested in hearing conversations with private equity leaders, CEOs of private equity-backed companies, and startup entrepreneurs where they share their stories about their career journeys, starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, and the important role that having the right talent plays in building a successful business, then you are in the right place. Welcome back to another episode of the Growth Capital Podcast. Here's your host, Justin Dixon. All right, Greg, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to talking to you today and seeing where this goes.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, let's give everybody a little bit of an overview of kind of who you are, what you're up to, and where you are, and then we'll kind of dig into some stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Greg Povenski. I spent 23 years in the Army, 18 of those as a Special Forces officer. Got to do a lot of cool kind of stuff while I was doing that. Finished up my career at the University of Michigan, teaching ROTC there. And while I was there, I did the executive MBA program at Northwestern University. So, and that really kind of turned me on to, getting out into a different realm once I left the military. I had an amazing professor, Mitchell Peterson, who's become a lifelong mentor at this point. He's kind of really the guy that kind of opened my eyes to, hey, there's a whole world out there of business that you can go play around in. So I did that. I got very lucky. I fell into a operating partner job at Cold Bore Capital, military founded, great little private equity firm, lower middle market focus out of Chicago. And I worked there for about 20 months. I ran I was on the regional XO. So I did kind of the compounding pharmacy roll up in Southern California. And then I ran the landscaping and dental platforms as an operating partner working with the CEO teams. Left there, took a little time off, went to a venture-backed space company, which was quite the education. So learned a lot about venture and like really startup, scrappy, like let's try and make this happen type of organization. So that was great. And then recently I kind of stepped away from that because I've started the executive PhD program at Oklahoma State. And I have a couple little side things, like we own a hotel here in Montana where I live. And so we had a couple things going on with that. So I really want to be able to focus on school and the hotel for a couple months. So that's what I've been doing. And entering the second year of my PhD, I've got my dissertation topic locked in. I'm currently working on a tangential PE project as part of my curriculum. And then my dissertation will wind up being on private equity as well, specifically strategy, value creation, and entrepreneurial theory.
Got it. Well, I definitely want to dig into the value creation dissertation. But I guess I've had a few people on from Cold Bore. So, and I met Matt at a networking event earlier this year. And so I really am very intrigued by the kind of focus on military veterans and how they kind of integrate them into the PE world. But, I guess talk a little bit about your transition from the military into, the ROTC kind of training program, and then also, into Cold Bore. And then I definitely want to, peel back the onion a little bit on a space VC company, which is super fascinating. So,
yeah. So Like I said, I was at Michigan. I was convinced that, teaching ROTC, I wound up going to Kellogg for the executive MBA program there, and was like convinced I wanted to go be an investment banker, and realized that I was a 40-some-year-old man and wasn't going to start off at, working 100-hour weeks. So
Right.
I was talking to some people, especially like I said, Professor Peterson, they kind of just figured out where I could apply my skills. There's I'm sure everybody that goes to an MBA program loves their professors. There's just a dearth of, there's an amazing group of talent, a group of talent there that in the professors at the program, and they're also eye-opening. And I just really learned, I kind of likened it to when I went to language school. Every special forces soldier has to learn a second language.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So they really taught me, I learned Spanish, so they really taught me this business language. And as I learned more about it, I just became very fascinated by the process and started looking around, realized that operational side of finance I could be good at. So I worked on finding a PE firm that was looking for operating partners. Was very lucky to, like I said, find Cold Bore through a networking organization for veterans. Interviewed, got the job. There's very few employees when I first started. Great group of guys. Dan Quinn was my boss, another Army SF guy. Matt, Sergio, great guys, good team there, and just, had a great time, learned so much. It was just a very eye-opening experience. And I realized that veterans, especially special operations veterans or high-performing veterans, could be a very good fit for that industry. So that's kind of what I did there, and really enjoyed that time.
And what was your role? You mentioned kind of a compounding pharmacy roll up, and then shifting into more like a landscaping, and so maybe give if folks haven't listened to the other episodes, like what is Cold Bore and their strategy? Obviously relating into training and bringing in veterans, but from a business roll up strategy, how does that work?
Well, I think they really believe that and they try to focus on how special operations veterans, because of their military training, are very good at working in these highly ambiguous environments where it's basically the guidance is go make that company better, figure it out, learn to do, teach yourself this. And so the pharmacy was a great place to learn that. We bought 11 specialty pharmacies in Southern California. I was the kind of the West Coast guy, and then we had a pilot that was the East Coast operating manager for those. And it was everything from helping strategic value creation to rolling up your sleeves and taking pictures of the drug cages so you could get recertified. So it was everything from these very tactical level jobs to the strategic, what's the end game here. So, and I think that Cold Bore does a very good job of placing the kind of veterans that they're looking at. They place those people into these roles that fit very well with what they're used to doing in the military. Like I said, basically where it's very limited guidance and kind of make it work. And not only do we expect you to do these very high level strategic things, but if somebody needs to stock the shelves at the Pets Wellness Group, you better be stocking shelves too. So I think it's a good fit all around between special operations veterans and what Cold Bore does.
Yeah. And then what made you kind of transition out of there and then kind of take a break and then do the space company? Well,
I think I made the mistake a lot of veterans make. Don't want to speak in absolutes, but I didn't take a break from school. School to retire from the military, right into full-time work. And it was just, I was traveling a lot, and I've got my son was young then, he's a little bit older now. So it was, you just kind of needed a break. So I took some time off. I got recruited by the space company, same type of thing, operational role. I would say focused more on performance improvement there than I did on kind of a more broader spectrum. Basically if I was showing up, it was like, hey, how can we make this better? There's a lot of talent in those companies. Voyager Space was the company I worked for. There's a lot of talent there. Some great individuals that I wound up working with. My boss, Frank, was, great guy to work with, and really taught me a lot about, he'd been in that industry, the aerospace industry and defense industry for a long time. And it's just a different animal. You're learning how to deal with government contracts and stuff. You're chasing constantly kind of these, proposals. I got CEO responsibility for a couple of months of one of the smaller companies there as they transitioned from the holding company model to a fully integrated operating model. And I got to be part of the team that integrated those companies from 7 holding companies into 3, aligned segments that were kind of wrapped around like what they were good at, so core competency focus segments that kind of fit together well and were very complementary.
And what was the focus of Voyager Space?
Well, their big project, they are running Starlab, which is going to be, it's competing to be one of the replacements for the ISS.
Okay.
They had the company that I got to be in charge of for a little bit was Pioneer Astronautics was kind of what I would call an idea shop almost, right? Like they had just these great ideas that were kind of, I mean, like they made like a thing that you could, this regolith, moon regolith, which is like the dirt on the moon. They made this device that could pull the hydrogen and oxygen out of the subsurface of the moon. It was just, just incredibly brilliant people. And there was times when they would come into my office and talk to me. I'd like, sounds great. And then they would leave and have to Google what they were just talking about. Because, you're talking about like chemistry, PhDs, and, just these incredibly brilliant people that, the former CEO had a PhD in engineering, like just great, minds. So I learned so much. And then, like I said, just kind of needed to take some time off to focus on the second half of my school program was a little difficult. And then the second half of the first year is a little difficult. And then, like I said, we had a bunch of stuff going on at the hotel that we own. So I wanted to be here to be able to oversee a lot of that and not be moving in and out every week.
Yeah. And not to dig too deep in the Voyager thing, I just found it fascinating just with, SpaceX and all the, things that are going on in space and everything. How did you get into running like businesses, and how did it working with people that, you've got to Google what they're saying to kind of make it all make sense? Like, obviously you've got a business mind and an operational mind. And so I imagine that was a benefit that maybe they didn't have, but how did you mix and mingle that, for success?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is recognizing that I was never the smartest guy in the room when I was the only guy in the room, right? So there's a lot of just so many brilliant people, and you just got to recognize, and I think that takes, I think that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I've been very fortunate my entire military career, my entire career post-military, where I've worked with so many smart people. I'm kind of used to it at this point, right? So, yeah. And they're just kind of like, you're pulling in, this sponge for their knowledge. And, I have this like one example. They just love what they did so much. It was infectious. And the example I have is one of the guys that worked for me at the small company I was at. We were having a discussion around the number of, it's basically like the number of letters in in a language double based on, and he had all this whole big long thing around like letters doubling, and like it's this whole mathematical stuff. And I said, what's interesting? Just kind of said it off the cuff. Like, what's interesting? Like, it'd be cool to know if that's how like predator-prey relationships work, right? Just kind of thought that was really neat. This guy went home and figured it out. He was that kind of guy, right? He's like, if you look at like lion zebra populations, it kind of follows this language, model as well. And, it's just those kind of people that really just loved what they're doing, wanted to be there, and wanted to solve probably the hardest problem facing mankind right now is like, how do we go beyond the borders of this planet? Elon Musk is doing all this stuff, but there's so many other parts of it. Like the man that ran the Pioneer before me is like the foremost expert on colonizing Mars. Like, and that's his big dream, right? So when you talk to people like that it's very easy to be caught up in their passion for the job. So I think that's what helped me the most there.
Yeah, I would imagine, being around people like that and they have all these ideas that are way above my brain power. It's probably, I would say, maybe I'll speak for myself, it would be easy for me to be like, everything sounds amazing, but it's like, obviously you've got to pick and choose the paths that you drive down, especially being backed by VC or any kind of investor, is you can't chase all the shiny objects, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
Was your role to kind of corral them a little bit and make sure that we're not driving down too many roads at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. You've got to focus on these proposals that are out there. When NASA says, "Hey, we'd like to really figure out how to land on the sun," you have to say, like, "Hey, that's not what we do here. We're focused on going this other way." And the space station was one of their biggest project. And so it was kind of like, how do we blend all these 7 companies to do that, right? Like, that needs to be our focus. And they didn't do rocketry. They weren't like a rocket company. So their stuff was more, they had a lot of laser communication, some of these idea shops. They had this great company, Altius, that had magnetic. They did a lot of cool stuff with magnets. So they had kind of like industries that were beyond once you get out of the atmosphere, I guess would be the way to put it, right? Like, everything they did was kind of focused off planet type stuff. And so that was like just really, really interesting to see. And then also, again, it's not being afraid to ask for help, right? So I would go to my boss and I would say, hey, look, they're doing this. I don't really know if that fits. Tell me if this makes sense. We had amazing, Paul Shower, who worked for me. Paul was a great contracting person. So you could understand like, hey, Paul, I don't know how to, like, what does this mean, this contract? And they're saying we've got to do this. Like, so having that kind of mix of talent and not being afraid to ask them for help, I think is the key to being able to swim in water that's way too deep for you. Yeah. So it was definitely intimidating every day. I hope it didn't show through every time I talked to them. I'm sure it did at points, but they're just great people, and I love working with them.
Yeah. What do you kind of feel the difference is between, working for a PE firm and a VC firm? Like, what do you think of the differences when it comes to like talent and metrics and speed? And obviously you're in two different industries, right? You're like roll up deals at Cold Bore, and then you've got these very ambitious space projects with Voyager.
I think the biggest thing is risk appetite first, right? Like VCs are like, hey, I got to hit one home run every 30 at bats. So we're going to spread the wealth around and see what happens. Whereas I think private equity firms have to be much more focused on, there's a good chance I'm going to be being able to exit this company because that's the only way my LPs make money. You know, the VC people that invest in VC, I think they get it, right? Like, well, for the most part, I think you got some people that just like to say, hey, I invested in a VC, right? But I do think that for the most part, the population of people that's investing in venture capital, they get it. Like, hey, I'm going to give you this money, whatever that is, $5 million, and I may never see it again, or I could see $200 million. So their risk appetite is different, for one. And I think from a talent standpoint, you need that. In VC, a lot of those leaders are that 0 to 1 person, right? Like start to sustainable, we're making money. All right, who takes it to the next step? Whereas in PE, I think you're looking for the other side of the spectrum where it's like, hey, we bought this company. It's already at 1. How do we go from 1 to, whatever, where our goal is? And I do think, and that's part of what my research is about. Like that's, how do we drive value in these alternative investment classes? And they're slightly different per the type of investment class you're talking about. But in general, I think those are the biggest differences, the risk appetite and the type of leadership and structure you're kind of looking for. I think maybe to the detriment of venture capital, a lot of the 2000 to 2018, 2019, that kind of hockey stick growth, and we'll throw all kind of money at it. I think that's kind of hurt them a little bit, so I think that's what you're seeing with some of the pullback in that market, so.
Well, yeah, I feel like the grow at all cost model is I don't know if it's dead, but it's definitely put on pause, right? I think we all kind of lived through the crazy times of 2021 and early 2022, and now it's like, oh no, we actually need to focus on business operations and profitability and or at least an eye towards it and not just focus on top line.
Sure.
I want to shift a little bit to your PhD dissertation and maybe just give a little bit of an overview of kind of the high level, kind of what the topic is, and then would love to drill down as it relates to value creation within a private equity firm and their portfolio.
Yeah. So, when I got into the program, I knew I wanted to study inside the lower middle market, private equity. It's expanded. So right now I'm looking at entrepreneurship through acquisition is this current project I'm working on, but eventually I will roll that research into my dissertation, which will be on ETA, private equity, to include captive fund and independent sponsor. And the big thing I'm looking at is there are, really two strategies in private equity, right? There's this harvesting strategy, and I think that's what 99.9% of PE firms do, right? So they buy a firm, they harvest off all the efficiency they can, as much as they can, and then they sell it. We've seen the research has shown that most private equity firms are selling their platforms just to the next rung up the ladder PE firm right now. That's kind of where a lot of the deal flow is going. And I'm very focused on the lower middle market and the middle market. I think that the big mega cap firms operate in such a different realm and at such different levels of scale. They're very two different animals, right? So I can't really study them the same way. So the basic research question I'm trying to answer is, what drives value? When you look at, there's a 2016 Bain study or a BCG study that 47%, 48% of enterprise value on exit comes from operational improvements, right? And that is very important because as we've gone into this new model of economic reality, right, where financial engineering can't really get you where you need to go anymore. That makes financial engineering makes up about 18% of the. Actually, let me quote my numbers correctly here. So financial, it makes about 13% of your total value, and then your multiple expansion or the arbitrage play makes up about 40%. So of all three of those, which are the three main drivers of value, the largest one is going to be in that operational excellence, operational improvement. The problem is, like, people say that, and I think it's one of those things that's become they don't really know what it means, right? Like, what's operational excellence means to you means something to another firm. My firm is different than your firm. Firm Y is different than firm A. So there's just my biggest research area where I want to look at is, are these harvesting strategies really operational excellence? My initial gut feeling is no. To entrepreneurial change is really what drives top line growth. So when we look at, I could nerd out on all the different definitions of entrepreneurship that's out there. Entrepreneurship is a very growing field. It's highly understudied compared to other fields within the business sciences type area. So there's multiple definitions of what's entrepreneurship. For the purpose of my study, entrepreneurship means changing the way the business does business and chasing top line growth. And I think you see a lot of private equity firms that want to just get that multiple or that operational efficiency down as low as they can, as much of it as they can. The problem is you can never make something 100% efficient, right? So they're already starting at a disadvantage, right? So, and by that I mean, if they take a company that's 80% efficient and they take it to 90% efficient, when they go to sell it, there's only 5-7 points more for the next firm to squeeze out of it.
Right.
So that makes it a tough. That's why I believe part of what I'm looking at is that's why hold times are getting longer, right? Like I think the next rung up the ladder, besides the financial side of it, the next rung up the ladder PE firm is like, well, what am I going to do with this thing? Like, I can only squeeze so much more juice out of it. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that when we talk about operational excellence, I think a lot of people look at that 100-day plan and they're like, okay, we're all integrated, go. I think that's done not as fully as it could be within the industry. And then really what I'm looking at is would a top line focus growth strategy make more money? And, it seems like a duh question, but it's really not, because if you look at how firms operate, there's very few firms that focus on that top line growth, because the easiest way to grow EBIT is to buy it. So that's the first thing they rely on, I think. And the second way is to, like I said, that harvesting, kind of pull all the efficiency out that you can. And then the third way is really to change the way the business works, right? The fundamental models. Like when you look at like a restoration company, are they adding carpet installation in, or are they adding woodworking, wood repair into their what are they adding into their offerings that grows their current, it increases revenue from their current customer base and also grows them into other markets. So that's the big thing I'm looking at. And then I trace that back to the ability, we can, and this is another thing I know you don't want to get too much into the human capital side of it, but on the human capital side of the equation, I don't think we hire correctly. So one of the things I'm looking at are, you can test for certain levels of entrepreneurial passion and entrepreneurial alertness. There's, empirically proven scales that I can give you a survey. Those scales tend to be focused on, kind of the in entrepreneurial passion. There's 3 types of IDs you can associate with, and each one of those IDs kind of they're better at certain things than others. So the model of what I'm looking at is, I take this person that's got good I test somebody for their entrepreneurial passion, I test them for their entrepreneurial alertness. Do those things, 1, drive better acquisition of firms? Can they buy more firms that way? And 2, once they buy them, do they improve them better than people that don't have them? And then there's some leadership style stuff in there. Basically it's a transformational, transactional leadership dichotomy I'm kind of looking at, which is, transformational leaders are better at storytelling, getting buy-in. So can they, one, get the seller in the ETA project I'm currently looking at? The measure is, can they really get the seller to sell them the firm? And if they do, can they get the workers at those firms to buy into the new plan and make the firm more successful?
So there's a lot to unpack there, and we don't have 5 hours to unpack it, unfortunately. Yeah. So I want to go back to the driving value top line kind of focus. So are you kind of talking about are you thinking that the 2021 grow at all cost model is the right way to grow operational efficiency, or is it you need to kind of take the grow at all cost top line focus, but measure it and kind of be a little bit more restrictive on just focusing on blowing out the top line and not thinking about the other operational efficiencies or the other levers that you can pull to create value?
So I think the firm grows and morphs over time, right? So maybe initially that harvesting strategy is correct, right? Sorry about that. I got but really what I'm getting at is not so much, I want to have a balanced focus, right? Mm. So yes, you need to make this machine efficient, right? But that's not the only thing you need to do. You need to add in these new offerings or a differentiated way in which you do business. When you look at Porter, again, not to get too wonky on it, but Porter talks about strategy, what a strategy is, and a competitive advantage is something that can't be repeated. But when you look at the harvesting strategy, every PE firm in the world is doing that, right? So it's not really a competitive advantage. It can be if you do it differently, right? Maybe it can provide you some advantage up front, but is it sustainable advantage? My argument would be no, and that's kind of what I'm looking at as well. So I think the biggest thing I'm looking at is entrepreneurial focus will give you a competitive advantage that is sustainable and can differentiate you from other firms. There's 6,600 lower middle market firms in the United States.
Wow.
How 6,600 plus, right? So how do you stand out in that crowd? How do you show the non-fungible, the people that have these non-fungible resources of money, right? How do you show them hey, I'm better, I'm going to get you more return. Yeah. Rather than just kind of, sending your pitch deck out to 500 people and maybe you get a hit rate of, 1 or 2%, right? And that's how you raise your money. So this strategy in general informs so many parts of what a PE firm should be doing, how you should be thinking about operational efficiency, how you should be thinking about your acquisitive, as you add on, and how you should be thinking about your offerings. You can't control the arbitrage point. You can't control the macro financial economics that affect PE. You can't control the arbitrage, like I said, because those multiples are all based on, supply and demand and all that. But what you can control is the way in which you enact your operational efficiency and value creation. And that's the one thing a firm can grab a hold of and do differently and do better. And I believe that what I'm looking at will help them do that.
And with the entrepreneurial mindset, are you talking about the CEO that is driving the company, or are you thinking more around the maybe the operating partner within a PE firm, or both, making sure they have that operational mindset, passion, trait that will eventually or hopefully kind of drive the value?
Yeah, so I think it's a mix. I'd love to. So in this initial project, I guess start from there. The initial project, because I'm looking at ETA, searchers, I can focus on that one person. Obviously, as you get to, top TMT, top management teams, there is a group effect that would occur. That would be a great follow-on study for my dissertation. How does the TMT then affect that? And then also at what level is the most impact? Is it the portfolio company TMT? Is it the board of directors TMT? Or is it the actual PE firm TMT? Because you've got different distillations of PE firms out there. Some are very hands-on, very controlling. Some are like, hey man, go make us money. And then some kind of that in the middle. And just like you've got some of the research I've seen has 4 different operating partner models, right? You've got kind of that internal consultant, you've got the subject matter expert, you've got the person that can come in and run the company, until they get to a certain level of scale. So all that stuff is stuff that eventually I would love to look at and see what drives the most value. I think right now my major focus is on the leadership at the singular person level, and at the PE firm it will be at the portfolio. For my dissertation, it'll probably be at the portfolio company, like CEO level.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, the PE firms, the investment folks are financially minded people, and obviously you have to have a strong operating partner model, regardless of how you define operating partner, that can help a CEO, whether it's a first-time CEO or the founder that's transitioning into kind of that, hey, I took it from 0 to 1, but now I got to take it from 1 to 10 and beyond. Because sometimes that is a different person, right? Like you talked about. So to dig into the human capital side a bit, you talked about testing for entrepreneurial passion and traits, and you also said kind of that we don't hire correctly. So maybe kind of unpack both of those, because I'm very curious about one, being in my world, I hire people a lot for companies, and every company seems to have a different hiring process, or they say they hire differently, and a lot of times, sometimes it is similar. So I'm just kind of curious. Maybe let's start with the testing piece and for the entrepreneurial passion, because I think that's interesting. And then maybe unpack a little bit of the hiring process, maybe different things that we could do to improve it.
Yeah, for sure. So when I test for entrepreneurial passion and entrepreneurial alertness, entrepreneurial passion is based on according to what is her name?
And are you using an assessment or a tool, or is it more you crafted? Okay.
Yeah. So what winds up happening is you'll get a group. Somebody will go to study this, and if there's no measure that's already been invented, they will kind of go out and invent the measure, right? So
yeah.
When they invent the measure, then they run it through some statistical analysis, make sure that it fits, and then it's provable that yes, this thing works. And there's empirical data behind that, right? It's not just like I know a lot of people are familiar with the Myers-Briggs. The Myers-Briggs is really kind of like your work horoscope. It's been debunked so many times. The research has taken it apart, right? So the things that I'm using are things that will stand up to academic level scrutiny that says, hey, these things work. So like, for example, I'm using for entrepreneurial passion. So Professor Cardone, she's at Tennessee. She's studied that a lot. She's developed a 13 point scale, a 13 question scale, where you ask these questions in a survey, and based on how people answer, you can tell how much entrepreneurial passion they have. And then by doing that, you can also, she has 3 identities. There's a developing, identifying, and developing, inventing, and founding identity, and she can kind of figure out kind of how you fall. This survey will kind of tell how you fall out in that, and each one of those things has strengths and weaknesses as well. So so there's that, and then like for leadership, the MLQ, which is the it's this massive document's been around forever, that test for leadership ability. I'm using a short version of that. That's only 8 scales long, seven questions long. So because what you don't want to do is give somebody an 80 question survey, because then they just get kind of wiped out.
Yeah.
And then for entrepreneurial alertness, which is based on a Kerzner theory, I'm using some scales that were developed by a guy named Tang, and there's 13 of those. So all in all, I give people about 33 questions, and from those 33 questions, I haven't done it yet, but as part of the study, what it'll do is it'll wind up giving us this data where we can go back and say, all right, we look at this is how they scored. Based on how they scored and the performance of their firm, we'll be able to say, like, especially in this ETA study, we'll be able to say, like, one, they were able to acquire a firm. That's the time one measurement. So many that have high entrepreneurial alertness led to a better than average acquisition probability. And then the time 2 is how well did the firm perform after they bought it. So when they look at that, the people that had high identity or high inventing identity, they have their firms tend to perform better, or people that have higher transformational leadership ability, their firms tend to perform better. When you look at, so Stanford's really grabbed a hold of the entrepreneurship through acquisition world. They're really kind of it was invented at Harvard. Stanford's really kind of driving the train. So they put out a study every year. Their latest study, for every 100 searchers that go out there and look for a firm, you get you've got about a 48% chance of recognizing a return. So the first cut, only about 30 some people do not make a acquisition at all. So that's a total loss of the initial invested capital.
Yep.
Of those people, 66% of or 68% of the group that actually makes an acquisition actually show a return. So when you do that all the way back to 100, you get about 48 out of 100 searchers actually make a return on investment between 1x and 10x plus, right? So with the majority being around that 2 to 5x return. So it's a coin flip. So I believe that what we're studying here and what I'm working on will increase the ability for firms to identify people that are going to be better than that coin flip.
And when you're thinking about the kind of ETA, this entrepreneurship through acquisition, and you're assessing talent, is it more that you're trying to provide data to the private equity firm to say, here is if you're looking for a new CEO of a portfolio company that you just acquired or you're about to acquire, this person has a higher probability of being a successful CEO in that portfolio company. So you're actually so if I think about it, you're providing this data as almost like an interview assessment tool to provide information to the private equity firm, or are you looking at it in a true search fund model where it's like, hey, I'm an entrepreneur, or I want to raise money to go find a company that I'm going to run, and then build that to a certain point, sell it, and return capital. Like there's two thought processes or structures. One is kind of like Justin is going out and finding a business versus maybe Justin is interviewing for a CEO role within a private equity firm's portfolio, or is it both?
Yeah, so it's right now for the ETA, it's being able to provide funds that invest in. From a practitioner standpoint, it would be the best use case would be for a fund that wants to fund somebody's ETA, to look at that person, put them through this test, and then say, hey, look, you're high on this scale. We've shown empirically that tends to lead us a better chance of recognizing a return. So you're the person we're going to go after. So that's on that side. Once I roll it all into the dissertation, though, it would look at that same kind of thing, but in a way that was, here's the team or the individual that should be driving the bus here.
Got it.
And that's going to lead to better, because I don't have the time, I'd love to look at a PE investment from, beginning to end. I'm really looking at that first year to 18 months improvement. Yeah. And then that using that as a proxy to say, hey, look, this thing percentage increase in EBITDA was 14% for people that were high on leadership, but it was only 8% for people that were low on leadership. So that should inform part of the hiring process.
Yeah.
In general.
Well, let's talk about that. You said that we don't hire correctly. So I guess is it we don't assess talent correctly, or the structure is inefficient? What have you seen in your time within PE and VC about that is there's an area of opportunity? Yeah.
So I think firms are starting to come around. They're hiring more operation partners. But when you look at traditional PE recruiting, where do they recruit from? They recruit from investment banks, right? So are those the best people? When you look at, you have so much dollars to run your firm, is the best use of those dollars hiring another analyst, or is it hiring an operator that can do? Now, obviously people are going to say when they listen to this, well, Greg, you used to be an operator. Of course you believe that, right? So I got to take some of my own personal bias out of it. Yeah. But if operational excellence really is the key driver right now, like they say it is, then firms should be 100% focused on, not 100%, but they should have a heavy focus on operations. There are firms out there that have no operating partners, right? They rely on the CEO teams the C-suite teams to kind of drive that value, which is fine as long as my argument would be, when we go circle back to what we talked about before, is that they'd have to be more hands-on, right? Really make those, so it can't be kind of this, let them go and see what they do. But I think in general in hiring, we talk about innovation, AI and all these things that are out there in the hiring world now, but we still hire people like 1950, right? So by that, I mean, you give somebody your resume, they read your resume, or nowadays software reads it and says, this is a good person. And then we have a couple conversations, maybe in PE, sometimes, I had to do a case study, maybe you get some of that. Sometimes they don't think you get a lot of that, right?
Yeah.
And then they're like, yep, I think I can work with this person. They seem all right. I'm going to hire them. I'm not saying get rid of that part of it. I think that part's highly important. You should definitely need to be able to get along with the people you work with. You need to be able to see that the person you're talking to and you're interviewing is not a complete, all over the place kind of person.
Yeah.
But layering on this empirical studies, I think will get you a better, clearer picture of what you're looking for. And it could even identify things, eventually. I think you could be able to identify, like, this person will be good on the deal team because they're very transactional. They understand. They don't have high entrepreneurs. I'm not saying it's a disqualifier. It's just how do I place them best to make best use of my talent? And then it would help you as a firm know, like, if you're the managing partner, you would know, like, hey, I'm really lacking on people that are good at X, Y, or Z. This one little part that Greg did can tell me if they're good at X, so I can figure that out. And then I'm sure there's more studies out there where you can look at why. So I think that's the biggest issue that we face in hiring, because I don't think firms use all the tools at their disposal, right? And I think they could, and it would, hiring is expensive.
Yeah.
So we want to make the right choice and get people in the right butts in the right seats. And I think this could help.
Yeah. And I think, I work with a lot of PE firms and I work with a lot of just regular companies, and some companies live and die by certain assessments, right? They have assessments as part of their process, and they think that they're great. Other ones, don't use assessments, and they have their reasons for that as well. And I'm not biased one way or the other. I think in certain circumstances, I think they make sense. But to your point, having an assessment that is kind of evaluating the person and how they think about operations, and one person may be super entrepreneurial in the sense that they have a lot of ideas, but they don't have any follow through on those ideas. And so those people are great to pair with somebody that's more operationally minded, because then they can say, here's my idea, and then they run with it and test it and see if it works, right? You may have heard of an assessment. I'm not sponsoring them or anything, but the Colby assessment is kind of interesting in just how it kind of talks about people's traits and how they show up kind of more organically and in kind of like a kind of free business setting, which I found fascinating. Again, no sponsorship or anything like that, but it's kind of interesting.
No, there's tons of great scales out there. I think the biggest, part of me going to this program is I don't want to be a professor. I have obviously I love talking to people and helping them get better at this. But my end state is not to be a tenured professor at a business school. My end state is to narrow that academic practitioner gap, right? And part of that is you as a CEO or managing partner of PE firm, you don't have time to read a 37-page journal article that I wrote for my PhD study.
Right.
That, when you get into the methods section, you're going to be like, I don't care what kind of tests you ran on these things. And I want to be able to break that down for firms that in a way that says, hey, look, and I think firms, or me, not just me, but I think firms can go out and hire people like me or look for people like me that say, hey, look, we really want to get it right with people. When you look at professional athletes, the biggest problem that a lot of the big four will tell you, big four, NBA, NFL, MLB, and NHL, is hitting on their draft picks. Like, how do we get that right?
Yeah.
And, they've done there's some very cool kind of like innovative ways that they've gone about looking at those people to kind of improve that hit rate. So I think on the same thing, you're looking for a very specific type of person to drive value at your organization. They need to have X, Y, and Z. Let's go find out if they have it. And that, I don't think that comes out a lot of times in conversations. Like right now, you would not be able to tell whether or not I'm good at entrepreneurship.
Right.
So
yeah, and also people are on their best behaviors in interviews, right? So you're not always getting their true, authentic selves and how they would show up. You're always, it's like dating, right? You're always on your best behavior and you're dressed appropriately, and you're not sharing the weirdnesses of your personality or your things like that. So So we could talk about kind of the hiring process and the talent side of this for days, I feel like. But I want to shift a little bit here, just kind of thinking about, what you're seeing. And obviously you've been in private equity, you've been in VC. So, maybe think about, we're recording this in early November 24. So what do you think the next kind of 12 months, if we jumped on a podcast in 12 months from now, where do you think the private equity and or the VC world are? Because it seems like, deal flow is cooled over the last few years, but it seems to be, starting to crack through and things seem to be start heating up. And but yeah, maybe what's your thoughts as you're kind of doing all this research?
Well, today would probably be the best day to ask that question, right? Because by the end of today or tomorrow, we're going to kind of figure out what it's going to look like down the road here in a little bit. Yeah. But I think there's, again, and that's kind of what I was going back to, like the macro environment. We can't control that, right? So I think deal flow is going to start to come back. It has to, right? But the firms that embrace kind of a different methodology are going to be the ones that really excel. Because I do believe still that a lot of fundraising is very relationship based. I don't know if that'll immediately translate to changes in where people are, which firms are getting capital, right? I don't know. I can't break into that. I don't have the data behind being able to break into that code and say like, oh, well, if you show a 6% better return than your competitors, you're always going to get the capital. I don't think that's always the case, right? Part of that is the storytelling thing that I am, the leadership and storytelling that I am looking at, right? So I think deal flow is going to come back. I think that firms that embrace kind of some new methodologies, new ways about going about business are going to do a little bit better. And I also think that firms that don't have operational teams, I think they're either going to have to outsource that or they're going to need to start hiring it in-house, because if they don't have that expert, especially when you look at how the supply chain is changing and how all these things, like what's AI going to do? What's all this stuff that's going on? Like, if you don't have somebody that can really talk common sense and not that it's nefarious, but if your CEO knows more than you do as the managing partner of this firm about what's going on, and he or she can't break it down for you in a way that makes sense, how do you control? It's kind of like going back to the space company. Like, I was constantly having to go ask questions because I didn't know what they were talking about.
Right. So
if you don't embrace kind of that subject matter expert operating partner model and start building that skill out, like I said, you're going to have to outsource it, or I think it's going to be very detrimental to your returns.
Yeah. No, I've talked to a number of firms, and it seems like they are reading your message, even if they're not reading your message, in the sense of hiring more operational partners and making them a core focus of the team, especially people that are experienced CEOs that can come in and help a maybe newer CEO, drive operational efficiency in that first, call it 12 to 18 months of acquisition, because that's obviously a very important critical time to your point, squeeze as much value out of it as they possibly can. So super fascinating. Oh, go ahead.
To go with that, some of the research I've seen, it says it takes about 27 months for a program you put in place to really show sustainable returns, right? So you got to think about shepherding and that having that person you were just talking about being able to say like, hey, this is why this is happening. This is what's going on. We need to wait. It's not, you can't get that quick hit of an 8% jump in EBITDA. It might take 3 years to get it, but you're going to get it. And we have to do this, because if we don't do this now, 4 years from now, when we try to add in this next level, we're just not going to be ready for it. So it goes very, they're saying.
And to your point about, hiring is very expensive, getting the wrong hire is very expensive, right? And so if you have to wait, call it even 12 to 18 months to recognize that this person isn't the right fit, now you're back, behind the 8 ball even further. So to your point, if you can improve your hiring process and make that, to even 10, 15% more efficient in kind of weeding out bad hires, then you're going to be very successful in whatever you do if you can hire the right people in a better time.
Just to clarify something real quick, I went and looked it up because I want to make sure my numbers are right.
Yeah.
So out of 100 people, 66 make an acquisition. Of that 66%, 73% of that 66, which is where you get the 48%. 73% recognize 73% of 66, which is 48, is where you get that return. So I just want to make sure my numbers are right. case anybody at school's listening to this and be like, Greg, you're not quoting the right research.
Yeah, you got to make sure you quote your right sources, right? No, that's fair. That's fair. All right, well, cool. Well, no, Greg, this has been awesome. Let me kind of transition to the end here because like I said, we could talk and peel back the onion even further on your dissertation and some of the research you're doing. But I want to be respectful of time, and so I want to finish with the 3-pack of questions I ask every guest. So, first question here: what is one of the most influential business books that you've read or listened to, recently?
So I think there's two. One is a group of books. All the Gladwell books, I think, were eye-opening. They were kind of the start of my journey of getting back into, especially, outliers. I love the methodology around figuring out why things were different. So I think that was such an influential, part of it. I read those right before I kind of went to start my MBA program or as part of my MBA program or in my MBA program. I read them. So those are all very influential books. I think I love the way, plus he tells a good story, right? So you got to be able to set the hook. So I think that was one. And then 2, I read a book called The Myth of Private Equity, and it really kind of took the industry apart, piece. And there was definitely, when I say influential, it made me, again, think about like, why are these things going on? There's definitely an agenda by the author, so you got to kind of get through that, right? But if you can kind of look at like, I think one of the most interesting statistics he threw out there is 74% of PE firms classify themselves in the top quartile of all PE firms. So that math isn't mathin', right? So it's just like, again, I think the two of those go together because they were books that really made me kind of sit back and think like, hey, this is why things are happening, figure out why it's happening, and find the solution to make it better. So I think those are probably the two that I would quote. Yeah.
Interesting. No, I'll have to check that one out. I hadn't heard of that one. So that's interesting. All right. What's your favorite thing to do outside of work? And maybe since you're in Montana, I'm assuming it's something super outdoors, but maybe not.
Yep, for sure. So that's part of the reason we moved here. I'm a big backcountry hunting and hiking, and I try to be a fly fisherman. I would call it more like throwing a line in the water. I'm not really good at it. But so I love to do that. It's part of the reason we moved out here. My wife is big on the outdoors, and my son is, a big motivator behind getting out there and doing cool stuff. So we love to get outside here. And if you're ever in the Bitterroot Valley, there's so much to do here. So, it's just a lot to do, and we love doing it.
Awesome. Very cool. What is your favorite vacation spot?
Oh, it's a tough one. So my wife and I took my son to Finland. Best trip we've gone on lately is Finland. So we went to Finland, and we took my son to the Santa Claus Village north of the Arctic Circle in November. So I don't know if you've ever been in Finland, the Arctic Circle in November in Finland, but it's not bathing suit weather. But it was great. We had a great time. Super great, to see kind of that cool, I've never been that far north, and it was just like all this really cool stuff. So I think that was kind of the best vacation we've been on lately. But I always love going anywhere, new countries, love to travel to new countries to see, we've been to Machu Picchu, we've been to, the Caribbean, we've been to Costa Rica. So I think just traveling outside the United States, I would say in general is the best places to go.
Fair enough. No, this is super fascinating. Greg, if people want to, reach out to you, maybe learn more about kind of the research you're doing as part of your dissertation, or just want to pick your brain about, private equity or venture capital, like what's the best way to get you?
So my school email is gregory.povenski, and that's Povenski @okstate.edu. That's the best way for any kind of research-based question. I'm on LinkedIn. They can definitely come out and look for me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect that way. That seems like a very easy way to do it. Just warn anybody that reaches out. I will nerd out on this stuff for hours on end, so just be prepared.
Yeah, I know. We could have definitely gone down a rabbit hole for a while, but we've already done this for about 50 minutes. So, Greg, I really appreciate the time. This has been awesome. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you. If there's anything I can ever do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out.
I hope you found at least one actionable insight from this episode of the Growth Capital Podcast, your one-stop shop for insights from private equity leaders, CEOs, and startup entrepreneurs on starting, investing in, and scaling successful businesses, as well as the role having the right talent plays in growing a successful business. It would be greatly appreciated if you would rate and review this podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and drop us a comment so we can expand the audience of this podcast. Thank you for all your support, and don't forget about upcoming episodes dropping every Tuesday.